This is MS600 Lab1 Exercise 5. Now in this exercise, we'll be building a JavaScript single-page app using the Microsoft Authentication Library. Now the job of the Authentication Library is to sign in the user and through the library acquire a token for a specific Microsoft Graph API scope. Now if the token is issued by the identity platform to the single-page app, the single-page app can then take that access token and use that to invoke the Graph API with the bearers token header. So in this exercise, we'll be downloading a halfway done single-page app. Okay, I'll walk through what the code looks like. Okay, so once we download this single-page app, what we're going to do next is to configure our identity platform. Now to ensure that we have a static declaration of these permissions. Now remember, these permissions can be declared one of two ways. By statically declaring our single page app need those following scope permissions, or dynamically, which allows us to incrementally ask for more permissions without statically define them in the application object. So in this demonstration, all the permission we'll ask for will be statically declared. Okay, we're not going to do any dynamic scope request in this demonstration or in this lab exercise. So I'm going to go ahead and download and extract this file. All right, so I've downloaded and extracted the file into the folder called SPA single page app. Now this initial starter code, let's take a quick look. All right, so I'm going to start with package.json. Now this is going to tell us a list of packages that support our single page app. All right, so we're going to run on Node Express and we need a Morgan package. All right, so we're going to start by restoring some of the packages. All right, so this is a Node.js application. It's a pretty simple static page server. So whenever a request comes in, we're always going to deliver the index.html. And that's pretty much it. All we do is serving up this index.html. So now within the index.html, that's under the JavaScript SPA folder. So this is our home page pretty much. Now in here, right at the top, we have a link to the MSAL library, the Microsoft Authentication Library. Now that is a JavaScript library used to handle Microsoft authentication needs, such as signing users, such as obtaining tokens, so on and so forth. All right, so that is one of our library coming from the CDN minified version. All right. Okay, so we got two buttons on the page that once you click on one of the buttons will sign you in, the other one will sign you out, fair enough. And if you're signed in, we will show you profiles, we'll unclick show you your mail message. Obviously to see profiles, pretty straightforward. We could either get it from the JWT token or make a query to the Graph API to read your profile. Now the read email, the read mail simply will go to your Exchange mailbox. Now it depends on whether or not you have a mail set up. You might be able to see or not. All right, so also on line 65 through 68, we're including a few additional JavaScript. The first one is called Auth Config that configures our authentication authority. Okay, graph configuration, this takes us and configures where to send our graph queries to, and some UI related JavaScript. All right, so we're using the pop-up workflow. So as soon as you click on sign up, rather than redirect you to Microsoft where the whole page refreshes, we're going to use a pop-up dialog. So after you sign in, the dialog goes away, you stay on the same page. All right, and we're also going to include a graph.js, which take a look at what it is. All right, so I'm going to start with Auth Config.js. So in here, we need to identify this client application's client ID, authority, which is the tenant info, and the redirect URL. So once you configure this, our single page app will know where to send your request to in order to get your JWT sign-in tokens. All right, so this is the auth pop-up. Of course, we're going to start by reading the configuration. So the MSAL config comes from that file, so it knows where the tenants are. And during the sign-in, we're going to call the login pop-up. There's also a login redirect. Okay, so the pop-up will give you a pop-up dialog. All right, so once you sign in, we'll take a look at the console. So once we receive the ID token, we'll print out a message that we have acquired an ID token. All right, so if my MSAL object that came from that call, user agent application, because we are a browser app, right? We're not doing a Node.js backend call. This is going to all run directly in your browser. So the method we need is the user agent application, browser application. All right, so if we're able to get the account information, we're going to send that to the show welcome message, and that's going to be in the library somewhere. Okay. All right, so folks, the way I'm going to approach this lab is I'm going to run it. I'm going to see how it blows up, and I'm going to address it step by step. I want to make sure you understand how this lab sample works before we follow the instructions. So here I downloaded, I run it. I run it by opening up a terminal and did an npm start. It's going to start listening on port 3000. Now naturally, when I show you the auth.config, nothing's configured up, so everything's going to blow up right away. So going to the web page, nothing's going to work. Click on sign in, no response, everything blows up. That's the way it should be. All right, so I'm going to start configuring the JavaScript. So I need client ID, authority, and the redirect URI. So I'm going to go to Azure Active Directory to configure my single page app to obtain those three things. Now the sample code referenced by this lab activity, judging from the line 10 in the index.html, this is using the MSAL version 1, not the MSAL version 2. Now, why the version is important, difference is important, because they support different types of flows. In MSAL version 2, this is the code flow. This is called the authorization code flow with PKCE. Had we used this library in our sample code, when we register our application, we need to select different settings. So here is where my app is. Okay, so notice when I create a single page app as part of my registration, all right, so I'm going to say I want to register single page app. Okay, now it specific tells you that if you're using the MSAL.JS library, then this section does not apply to you. But the lab exercise we have is using the implicit grant workflow that is from the MSAL v1. So if you're looking at the code, this is the library version we're using. Okay, if you're interested in digging deeper, go to github.com/azuread. Now you'll find this authentication library for JS. Now it's imperative to know that the JavaScript can be used by the server side. So if you're writing a JavaScript application, then use this library. If you're building a browser application, so in other words, you're not running your application locally on an operating system, then you will be choosing from one of these two libraries, assuming you're building your own JavaScript program instead of using AngularJS. Okay, so we're not talking about this one here. We're actually talking about this one in this lab activity. So we'll be using implicit grant flow. Now there is samples that will show you how to make a workflow with PKCE, but this lab is created with this source downloaded, so it is what it is. We'll be using the v1. Okay, so to register this app, okay, the redirect URL, not that critical for us because we're not redirecting anything. We'll be doing a pop-up. Now make sure you have selected implicit grant because our library depends on the presence of these tokens. So after you configure this, we're in good shape. All right, single tenant is what we're going to do. Treat this application as public client. Yep. So it is a public client, I suppose. All right. So back to the overview. Make sure you take down the application ID, client ID, and plug it into your Auth Config. So that's your client ID. The authority is your tenant ID. And the redirect URI, just match it with however you specify in the application registration. All right. Now, as far as signing goes, let's see what happens after you get this taken care of. So I'm going to save this page, and I am going to try again. Okay. Doesn't seem to be running. Start again. All right, stand corrected. This should be HTTP. That doesn't have HTTPS in that server. Why would I think there's HTTPS? No idea. I'm using Visual Studio too much, and Visual Studio just gets you started with HTTPS, but not. Now, folks, one more thing. If you're doing OAuth of any flavor, remember your token will be flying back and forth in the headers, in the query strings, and all these other places. Do not ever run these single-page apps without HTTPS. It's just too easy to observe all these tokens going back and forth. So for the time being, I'm just going to stick that HTTP and make sure this matches what I really have. Okay. Now let's do another run at it. Okay, doesn't look like it's blowing up as bad. All right, so we do have an uncaught object. Authority URI must be HTTPS. That doesn't bode too well. So let's go ahead and do a sign in real quick. All right. All right, getting an error. Uncaught reference exception can't access. Sign in on click. All right. HTTP localhost 3000. So apparently it's saying that it doesn't know what my MSAL object is defined. So I'm going to go back and look at this sample code. All right, so folks, so one thing you want to make sure is the authority. If you're doing a single page app, the authority should be that of login.microsoft.com/your tenant ID. Now, if you're doing it for multi-tenant, you can replace that with /common, COMMON. If you're planning on supporting both Microsoft account and your tenant account, if you have a multi-tenant app. So right now I have a single tenant app, so I'm going to make sure authority look like that. So I'm going to try to sign in and see how far I can get. All right, so I'm going to save the change. Make sure I save the change. Okay, no balls. Lighting up next to the file name, so it's saved. So I'm going to reload this page. Didn't blow up as bad. Click on sign in. And I'm going to sign in with a local tenant account. All right, so this is my test user account. And do my password here. All right, so now it's prompted me to sign me in and continue to store the data after signing in. So I'm just click on accept. All right. Now let's see where we got so far. You can see the console that has some ID token that's been passed back. All right, so you can see the account identifier. So this is the ID token. All right, you can see the raw ID token. This came back from our console.log once we obtained the token. All right, so here's our ID token, and anytime you get an ID token, you can see the raw ID token. You can see it decodes into the various values, who the issuers are. ID token is all it requires if you just need a name. So here's a name, and here is a name, so it knows my name. However, Going out to see profile, what happens if I click on call profile? It should go out and make a graph call, but it should fail because I haven't actually configured those settings yet. I haven't configured any of the permissions for this app to delegate access to profile information, and I haven't configured mail, certainly no API access to the mail. So let's continue on and let's sign out. Okay, so we know the sign in works. So notice when we click on sign in, pops up, and this URL ensures that it knows the scope I want. Notice I'm asking for an ID token to come back because all I'm doing is signing in. And the scope I want is OpenID profile. Actually, it's probably easier to just put this whole thing on Notepad. All right, so if you look at this, you'll see that this request is forwarding to my tenant. So that's my tenant ID. My authorized endpoint. I'm asking for an ID token to come back, and the scope I'm looking for is the OpenID profile userinfo.read, and that's the two things I want. Client ID is representing my application, and when done, redirect back to the local home. All right, so those are the two scope I want. User read, OpenID profile, which is already taken care of as soon as you register an app. Because otherwise, why would you register an app to depend on Azure AD if your intention isn't to sign people in, right? So those are default expected scope to grant to an app. You don't have to do anything but register an app. So let's just make sure it's in the registration. So you can look at API permission and you'll see that user.read is pretty much a given. Okay, and the OpenID profile is just what information is included in JWT. Now, naturally, if you want to add additional pieces of data in the ID token, feel free to add optional claims so you don't have to come back and ask more things. So for instance, including in the ID token, you can include family names, email, countries, etc. So you don't have to come back and make another graph call. But for now, we're not worrying about this, just so long as you know it can be configured as optional claims. But right now, we want to configure MS Graph. So when you hit profile, you can get all those information from the graph endpoint. So I'm going to go back to the graph, the API permission. All right, so with this sample, I'm going to try to not statically define the scope permission because I suppose this single page app can do progressive requesting of the scope. So in other words, in the graph API, in the graph call, what we're going to do is ask for the permission just in time. Okay, so we do need to go back to our source code, graph config, and make sure our graph endpoint is squared away. So these two Microsoft Graph endpoint, one retrieves profile information, and the second one retrieves email messages. All right, so this is our graph endpoint configuration. Now in our graph.js, we're configuring the standard header for the bearer token. So someone's going to give us an access token. We'll construct that into the headers as a bearer token, and then append that as the authorization header, bearer token, and then make a get against those graph endpoints. So in other words, as long as you have the endpoint, you give me the endpoint, you give me the token, and you give me a callback. Okay, we will construct the header with the authorization header, bearers token. Okay, and it makes call, and when the data comes back, we're going to send it to the callback. Whatever callback you send to me, we're going to take the data and give it back to you. Now I want to quickly go back to Auth Config. So notice as part of the login request, we have requested OpenID profile user read. So once the consent is received for these scopes, we can read user profile. Now mail.read is a dynamically requested scope. So unless we click on the read mail button, okay, we won't be asking for that scope. So in other words, as our application goes, we can ask for consent just when we need it. So just in time consent. Okay, and these are dynamic scopes. We did not add this as part of our application registration. All right, so here's our UI. Nothing particularly interesting about that. All right. So I think that this is all it takes. We have the UI and okay. All right, so back to the index page. Once we sign in, as you saw before, we get a big button that says C profile, and it took me a while to hunt down where is the C profile. So the C profile is in auth popup.js. Now you're gonna find a method called C profile. Now, shouldn't that belong to the UI.js? But it's all right. So in a function C profile, if we're able to sign in successfully, we're gonna call get token popup. All right. So that get token popup is the method above. Now get token for what request? So in this call, we're going to get a token for the scope behind the login request. If you recall, login request is defined right here. So what exactly is login request again? For the 3 scopes. All right, so in a login request, we're going to get token for accessing those 3 scopes. So imagine your app is now asking Azure AD, hey, the user has signed in successfully. Now can I have the access token for these 3 scopes so I can make a request to Graph API? So this login request contains the 3 scopes. If we are able to get a response back successfully, that response is going to contain an access token, and we're going to pass that access token right on to call MS Graph. The endpoint is for profile, so you can find that under Graph Config.js. That's the /me endpoint in the Graph API. And when it's done, take the result and update UI, and that update UI is our callback, and that's got to be in the UI.js, right? Yep. So here is our data, and we're going to do some HTML magic, print out the titles and get the phone numbers, and just add those HTML element for the profile div. So it's going to get title, email, phone, and address if the data is available. So let's see if this part works. All right, so after I save all the changes, I'm going to give this some hard refresh. And good. Going to sign in again. All right, so I'm going to click on C profile, and hopefully it doesn't blow up. All right, so request made, and we got our data back. All right, so we don't have any title, we don't have phone, we don't have locations. That's fine. Let's make sure it's not rigged. So I'm going to go back to my Azure portal. Where is my Azure portal? All right, so I'm going to start populating this user with some info. So I'm going to go to users, just so you can see that it is not rigged. I'm going to VC user, and here's the profile. I'm going to start editing them. Title, where's title? Okay, what are the info we want? Of the short-term memory of a goldfish. I really should edit this out. So here's the phone number, here's the location, and the title. Okay. Title, phone, location. Don't forget that. Title, phone, location. Title. Is this job title? Mighty Chinzilla. Phone number? Dude, which phone? Office phone? Mobile phone? 555-1111 212-555-2222. So I can figure out it's a mobile phone, office phone. What else are we getting? location, sure. Location. Oh, do have a location, but apparently that's not what it's looking for. Street, state, office. I'll figure out what it's looking at. City, zip. Save that change. All right, so I'm going to have my app ask Azure AD one more time. Okay, sign in again. Show my profile. All right, so now we know the location is pointing at office, and the phone number is pointing at office phone. So there is that. All right, so notice we are able to make a graph call after we are able to obtain the token. Okay, so let me just make sure we are okay with what we're doing here. All right, so when you click on See Profile, we're going to call Get Token pop-up. In this function, we need to know what scope we want to receive. So the login request is nothing but a bunch of scopes. All right, so that scope let us do acquire token silent. So in other words, if we have this token in our token cache, there's no need, if we can acquire the token silently, so we don't need to ask the user for consent, and we're able to successfully get the token. This method will fail if we were to acquire a token for a scope that the user hasn't consented to, which in our next step, when we try to receive and read the emails, because that scope hasn't yet been consented to, this acquired token silent will fail. And when that happens, our catch will log those errors in the console, and it will now pop up in order to acquire token. Why pop up? Because we now need the user's consent. Are you going to share the email with this app? And the consent is obtained, then we're going to return the token response. All right. So in either case, if we're able to get the token silently, that means the consent has already been previously obtained. If it's not, that means we're going to do a dynamic incremental consent, because up to this point, the user hasn't accessed this part of the website. So there's no need to say, hey, do you consent, right? If you think back, there's some website, the moment you sign in, here is a laundry list of all the permission this app needs. And you're asking yourself, why am I consenting to all these permission if I'm not sure I'm going to use this part of the website? So imagine you are a website that has 10 different sections, right? Rather than asking the user to consent for everything this website needs, we can incrementally ask the user, hey, you're about to want me to sift through your email for you. Would you please grant the consent to the mail scope? All right, so this is called incremental consent, and that's what we're going to do for our email activity. All right, so there shouldn't be anything else to configure at this point, so I'm just going to go and click on read mails. Now, if everything goes according to plan, it's going to tell me you don't have consent for email. All right, so it's going to tell you the silent token acquisition failed, rightfully so. Because right now, if you look at here, guess what? You're going to see a scope for email, mail.read. It would like to read your mail. And that's what it says, read your email. And if you accept it, then we're able to obtain the token. All right. And it's going to say, getting that is not found. So one of the two things can happen. I either don't have email, I probably don't, because I have not set up Outlook for this account. So that there's that. But if there is, certainly will work. All right, so for completeness, because the last test user doesn't have an initialized Exchange mailbox, so I'm going to turn this application into a multi-tenant application. So to do that, I am going to change the Auth Config So you'll notice authority is no longer my tenant ID, rather it's now common. So besides setting the authority, I want to make you have to make sure the application is registered so that it's multi-tenant. So go to the application, as your ID, find the application, and go to the authentication section. Now, and when you scroll down, you can choose the radio button, accounts in any organization directory. So this will be a multi-tenant app after you make that change and save it. All right, so that's all it takes. Just make sure the authority is s/common instead of your tenant ID. Let's make it pointing to the right sign-in location. All right, and the same URL. Let's give it a try. All right, click on sign in. Okay, not the right account. All right, so I'm better off with the incognito window, localhost 3000. So I'm going to sign in with my personal account that has an exchange. Now notice this is not signing into my training directory that I created earlier. This is a completely separate account from another tenant. All right, so it's now asking to read my profile, and as soon as you click on accept, obtaining token, make the call. It's my information. Now reading email, same thing. It's now going to incrementally request permission. All right, so when you click on the read email, it should progressively solicit permissions to read your email, and if you accept it, the application will make the call and read some of my email titles. All right, so just me running some test against that mailbox, and apparently it's not yet initialized. So there you go. We can now turn a single tenant app into a multi-tenant app. All right, so that's the gist of the exercise. As far as the lab exercise 5 goes, it's very strange. But if you get what I'm showing you here, I suppose this is the learning points here. A JavaScript app uses this library, MSAL v1 or v2, participates in OAuth workflow in order to obtain a JWT token representing the user's identity. Now further, through consent, your web browser app can go out to Graph API and query user profile information or getting a list of emails. All right, so that's all in a graph and the auth. Now to wrap everything up, it's only responsible so that you know every time you consent something, you'll be able to keep track of that by going to myapplications.microsoft.com. When you go to myapplication.microsoft.com, you'll be able to find all the applications at some point that you have agreed to share your information with. So here I had a single page app called SPA, and this is the SPA app. So if I click on it, it will try to sign me in. Okay. Now, naturally, if you click on the ... you can manage this application, and this is where you can take back the permission you have granted. So it's a good idea to regularly review myapplications.microsoft.com to see if there's any application holding on access to things you have granted and you haven't used this service for a long time. Okay, just make sure you come back here occasionally and review all the permission that you have granted. So let's say I'm done with this exercise, I no longer need this app to read my email. I'm going to revoke this permission, so it will take it away from my apps. Okay, so you can see that I've done a lot of these activities, and you come back here occasionally if you no longer need this permission. You're not, for example, well, I still need this. I do demos on that sometimes. So if you have things that you no longer need, sample browser app. Yep, this is all I actually do need that. But if there's anything that's something that you don't use anymore, just make sure you get rid of it. Okay, there's no reason for it to maintain access to your profile and personal data. All right, so there's that for this exercise.